Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Colorado Republicans are publicly threatening to change how they vote for presidential nominees in light of yesterday's decision by the state Supreme Court in Colorado to bar Trump from the primary ballot under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The state GOP now saying it may begin the legally fraught process of switching from a primary to a caucus in order to allow its members to still cast their votes for Trump next March. As of now, that mostly just seems like posturing, to be honest. But for all of the controversy, when you go back to the relevant text used to raise the challenge, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, it really does stand out as pretty darn fitting. Quote, "No person shall hold any office under the United States who, having previously taken an oath as an officer of the United States to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof." You cannot hold government office if you are an insurrectionist or you supported insurrectionists. It's quite clear, quite simple, especially when you consider the amendment within the historical context of its ratification. But this decision from the Colorado Supreme Court yesterday still came as a shock, surprise. And that's largely, I think, because of the ways in which American legal culture has grown to emphasize, even fetishize some parts of the Constitution and its founding, while largely ignoring others. Around the 1980s, the American right embraced the judicial philosophy of originalism, thanks in large part to late conservative Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Basically, it's the idea that we should interpret the Constitution only as its founders intended and as people understood it at the time. To be clear, this was always a reactionary project, often undertaken in transparently bad faith, used to reverse engineer the right's preferred political outcomes and discarded when it didn't fit their agenda. But originalism remains the de facto legal theory of the American conservative movement and, honestly, the 6-3 Trump court. And it remains enormously effective as a rhetorical tool because it taps into our shared civic religion of reverence for our founders. With that in mind, then, I think it's worth looking at the history of the Reconstruction Amendments, which were ratified with the hope of refounding the country after the Civil War without the stain of slavery following the horrible carnage of that war.
When it was over, 600,000 men had perished. But the Union held, and the Constitution, like the nation, was reborn.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments together, but above all the 14th Amendment, is the fruit of the Civil War. It is what all those brave men fought for and died for.
It was from a PBS documentary about the war. These amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection, completely and utterly transformed the structure of American government. The legal ramifications of the 14th Amendment gave rise to everything we think of as the modern state and pluralistic multiracial democracy. It is impossible to overstate just how important it is to our current understanding of what America is and of constitutional law. And yet, its founding, the second founding of the country, the founding amendments after the war, the Reconstruction Amendments, is basically lost to history. Its drafters are not household names like the men who drafted the Bill of Rights. And there's a reason for that. Those men were political radicals. The people who drafted the Reconstruction Amendments were the vanguard of radicalism, in fact, who, after defeating the traitorous insurrectionist slave power of the South, forced them at gunpoint into a participatory multiracial democracy. Over the past 150 years, there's been an effort not to reckon with that uncompromising fact. That said, if you're going to take an originalist perspective here, that history is pretty important. The 14th Amendment was indeed a bold act of raw political power in furtherance of that project of multiracial democracy, and it should be interpreted as such. And the person most responsible for recovering that fundamental reality of our country's second founding and the constitutional provisions it created is Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Time and again, she has argued we cannot ignore the radical origins or radical meaning of the 14th Amendment, nor its original intention as a protector of marginalized people in the face of state oppression. This has been especially apparent when she talks about things like affirmative action and voting rights.
I understood that we looked at the history and traditions of the Constitution, at what the